A Story of Faith, Forbidden Love, and Choosing Yourself, Part 1, The Pulpit, every Sunday. I sat in the third pew and listened to Reverend Michael Hayes preach about grace. Grace, he'd say, his voice filling the cathedral, is God's unconditional love. It's the forgiveness we don't deserve. It's the acceptance we can't earn. And every Sunday, I'd think, he has no idea what he's talking about. My name is Christopher Walsh. I'm 29. I grew up in this church. And I've been in love with Michael Hayes since the first time I heard him preach 5 years ago. Michael is 38. He's been the pastor of Grace Cathedral for 7 years. He's everything a pastor should: be compassionate, intelligent, articulate, present. He's also absolutely, completely closeted. I knew because I recognized the signs. The careful way he never talked about dating, the way his eyes lingered on certain men in the congregation, the way he seemed to be performing himself every single moment. I knew because I was doing the exact same thing. For 5 years, I sat in that third pew and watched him. For 5 years, I told myself it was nothing. Just admiration, just respect for his spiritual leadership. It was a lie. Everything changed the night of the church fundraiser, Part 2. The fundraiser, the Grace Cathedral Annual Gala, was supposed to be simple. 500 people, silent auction, cocktail hour, dinner. I was there because my mother guilted me into helping with the event planning. Michael was there because he was the pastor. I'd managed for 5 years to keep things professional, to say hello, to shake his hand, to maintain distance. But that night, something shifted. The silent auction needed a final push. We were 5,000 short of our goal. Michael got up and made an appeal from the stage. Grace Cathedral isn't just about faith, he said. It's about community. It's about showing up for each other. It's about the radical act of loving our neighbors, loving our enemies, loving ourselves enough to be honest. For just a moment, his eyes found mine in the crowd. That's what grace really means, he continued. It's not God forgiving us. It's us forgiving ourselves for being human, for being flawed, for being exactly who we are. I felt something crack open inside my chest. After the event, when most people had left, I found myself in the kitchen helping clean up. Michael came in to help with the remaining dishes. We were alone. Good turnout, he said, carefully, like we were discussing the weather. Yeah, I said. Your speech was powerful. He didn't respond immediately. He just washed a plate very carefully, like it required all his concentration. I meant what I said, he finally said. About being honest, about forgiving ourselves, I know. Do you? He turned to look at me, and his eyes were raw. Because sometimes I think nobody understands how hard it is to stand in a pulpit and preach about grace when you're not practicing it yourself.
Oh.
I should have walked away, should have made an excuse and left. Instead, what aren't you practicing grace toward? Michael set down the plate. His hands were shaking. I can't, he said. I can't do this. Do what? Stand here with you and pretend I'm not. He stopped himself. Took a breath. I need to go. He left. I stood in the kitchen of Grace Cathedral, my hands in soapy water, and realized I'd just broken something irreparable. Part 3. The aftermath. Michael avoided me. Not obviously, he was too professional for that. But I noticed. After services, he'd talk to everyone except me. During committee meetings where we'd both be present, he'd keep his eyes firmly on the agenda. He'd stop by the sanctuary when I wasn't there, leave before I arrived. I'd broken the unspoken agreement we'd had, mutual denial. 2 months passed. I considered leaving the church. It would be easier, cleaner. I could find another congregation, put distance between us, move on. But I couldn't do it. Then one Wednesday night, there was a knock on my apartment door. It was Michael. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days, like he'd been wrestling with something and losing. Can we talk? He asked. We sat on my couch, careful not to touch, careful to maintain distance. I've been praying, Michael said. For 2 months I've been praying for clarity, for guidance, for God to take this away. What away? This, he said, gesturing between us. These feelings, this thing that's between us that I can't name, because if I name it, it becomes real, and if it becomes real, everything falls apart. Michael, do you know what it's like? He continued. To stand in front of thousands of people and preach about radical love while denying the most radical love of your own life. To tell people to be honest while living a lie. To preach grace while refusing to extend it to yourself. I know exactly what it's like, I said quietly. He looked at me. I can't do this, Christopher. I can't keep pretending. So what are you saying? I'm saying I'm in love with you, he said. I've been in love with you for years, and I can't keep denying it. And I'm terrified because if the church finds out, my career is over. My family will disown me. Everything I've built falls apart. Then why are you here? Because the alternative is dying inside. His voice broke. And I'd rather lose everything than lose myself. He kissed me then, there on my couch. With the kind of desperation of someone who'd been holding their breath for years and finally allowed themselves to breathe. Part 4. The secret: we were careful. We had to be. Michael would come to my apartment late at night, after everyone had gone home. We'd cook dinner together, watch movies, just exist as ourselves for a few hours. It was the most real either of us had ever felt, but we both knew it couldn't last. We need a plan, I said one night, while Michael was cooking pasta in my kitchen. What kind of plan? For when this becomes public, and it will become public, Michael. We can't hide forever. I know, he said quietly. I've been thinking about it. I could resign. Say I want to pursue other opportunities. Move away. Start over somewhere else. And then what? Spend the rest of your life running. What's the alternative? He asked, coming out to the church. You know what happens then? I lose my job. The church loses its pastor. The congregation tears itself apart with this debate. Or, I said slowly, the congregation grows. The church becomes a place where LGBTQ plus people actually feel welcome. You become a pastor who's honest about his faith and his life. You're not being realistic. Maybe not, I said. But I'm tired of being realistic. I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of pretending. Michael didn't respond. He just kept stirring the pasta sauce. Part 5. The decision: 3 months into our secret relationship, everything fell apart. Michael's sister came to visit. She was staying at his house, and she found something, a love letter I'd written him, left in his desk drawer. She called an emergency meeting with Michael and their mother. Michael called me afterward. She knows, he said. His voice was hollow. What happened? She read your letter. She confronted me. I couldn't lie anymore, Christopher. I told her everything. What did she say? She said she loves me, that she doesn't care if I'm gay, that she wants me to be happy. He paused. And then she said, the church needs to know that I can't keep living a lie. Michael, she's right, he said. She's right. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep preaching about grace while denying it to myself. So what are you going to do? I'm going to tell the church, he said. I'm going to tell them I'm gay. I'm going to tell them about you. And I'm going to let them decide if they can accept me or not. They won't accept you. Maybe not, he said. But I'll finally be able to accept myself. Part 6. The sermon the following Sunday, Michael stood at the pulpit and changed everything. I have something I need to tell you, he said. Something I should have told you years ago. Something I've been too afraid to tell you, because I've been too afraid to tell myself. The cathedral went quiet. My name is Michael Hayes. I'm your pastor. And I'm gay. I watched from the third pew as the congregation processed this information. For 7 years, he continued, I've been telling you about grace. I've been telling you that God loves you exactly as you are. I've been preaching radical acceptance while refusing to accept myself. He took a breath. I fell in love with someone. His name is Christopher Walsh. He's sitting in the third pew, and I love him more than I've ever loved anything in my life. And I can't keep standing here and preaching about grace while denying grace to the person I love most. His eyes found mine. So I'm resigning, he said. Not because I'm ashamed of being gay, but because this church has clearly stated that LGBTQ plus people are not welcome here, and I can't in good conscience continue to lead a congregation that excludes the people I love. But before I leave, I want to say this. If you're struggling with your identity, if you're hiding who you are because you're scared of what people will think, if you're pretending to be someone else to fit in a mime here to tell you that grace means accepting yourself, it means being brave enough to be honest. It means choosing love over fear. He stepped down from the pulpit. I choose love, he said. I choose myself. And I choose him. He walked directly to the third pew, took my hand, and kissed me in front of 500 people. Part 7. The New Church. The church divided, exactly as I'd predicted. Half the congregation was outraged. They demanded Michael's immediate termination, which he'd already provided by resigning. They sent angry letters, made nasty comments. Some even left the church entirely. The other half did something unexpected. They started asking questions. They started reading about LGBTQ plus theology. They started demanding that the church's leadership address this issue. And when the church's board refused to change their stance, they left not in anger, but in solidarity. Within 3 months, a group of church members approached Michael with a proposal. Start a new church. A church that actually practiced grace. A church that welcomed LGBTQ plus people without apology. Michael was terrified. I've never done this before. I don't know how to start a church. Neither did anyone else, I said. But you'll figure it out. 6 months after his public coming out, Michael stood in a rented community center with 200 people, some from Grace Cathedral. Some new members and started the Church of Radical Grace. His first sermon was about love. Grace, he said, isn't about judgment. It's not about fitting into someone else's box. It's about the radical act of accepting yourself and others exactly as they are. It's about love, real love, honest love, queer love. He looked at me in the front row. It's about having the courage to choose yourself, he said, even when it costs you everything. Part 8. The wilderness, the euphoria of that first service, didn't last forever. Adrenaline is a powerful drug, but it wears off. And when it did, we were left with the hangover of reality. Michael had lost his salary, his health insurance, and the parsonage he'd lived in for 7 years. Within a week of his resignation, the locks were changed at Grace Cathedral. He wasn't even allowed back inside to collect his books without a chaperone from the Board of Deacons. I watched him pack his life into cardboard boxes in the driveway of the house that was no longer his. He looked smaller somehow. Without the robes, without the pulpit, without the structure of the institution that had defined him since his 20s, he seemed untethered. Where does this go? I asked, holding a heavy box marked seminary notes. Your place, I guess, he said, trying to smile but failing. If there's room, there wasn't room. My apartment was a 1-bedroom bachelor pad designed for a man who spent most of his time at work. But we made room. We stacked boxes in the living room corners. We cleared out half my closet. We learned the intricate dance of sharing a bathroom sink at 7 a.m. The intimacy was intoxicating, but it was also terrifying. We had skipped the dating phase, the dinners, the movies. The slow build and jumped straight into survival mode. We were refugees of a war we'd started. One night, about 3 weeks in, I woke up to find the other side of the bed empty. I found Michael in the living room, sitting on the floor surrounded by boxes, staring at a blank wall. The streetlights from outside cast long, jagged shadows across his face. Hey, I whispered. Can't sleep? He didn't look at me. I don't know who I am anymore, Christopher. I sat down next to him. You're Michael. You're the man I love. Used to be Reverend Hayes, he said, his voice cracking. I knew what to do. I knew where to stand. Now, I'm just a guy who ruined his career and split a church in half. I'm checking my email and seeing death threats from people I baptized. I'm seeing old friends cross the street to avoid talking to me. You didn't ruin anything, I said firmly. You told the truth. Truth is expensive, he whispered. I hope I can afford it. I pulled him close, his head resting on my shoulder. We sat there until the sun came up. That was the first time I realized that love wasn't just about the grand gestures or the public declarations. It was about sitting on a cold floor at 3 a.m., holding someone together when they felt like falling apart. Part 9. The stone throwers, the Church of Radical Grace, was growing, but so was the noise outside. We were renting the community center week to week. It wasn't glamorous. We had to set up folding chairs every Sunday morning and take them down by noon so the center could host children's basketball games. There was no stained glass, no organ, no choir loft, just a portable sound system and a wooden podium I'd built in my garage. But the real problem wasn't the furniture. It was the hostility. A local conservative radio host had picked up the story. He called Michael the fallen shepherd and branded our new congregation as a cult of sin. It brought attention. The wrong kind. It started with angry emails. Then came the graffiti on the community center doors. Abomination. Leave. Then came the Sunday of the protest. We arrived early to set up coffee, only to find 20 people standing near the entrance holding signs. They weren't strangers. That was the hardest part. I recognized Mrs. Gable, who used to bake cookies for the youth group. I recognized Mr. Henderson, who had served on the finance committee with my father. They were chanting. Scriptures weaponized. Verses about judgment and fire. Michael froze in the parking lot. His hand gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Drive, he said. Just drive past. Michael, we have to go in. People are waiting. I can't face them, Christopher. Not them. Look at me. I reached over and covered his hand. They are past. They are fear. But look at who is waiting for you at the door. I pointed toward the entrance. Standing in front of the protesters, forming a human shield, were the members of our new church. There was Sarah, a lesbian mother of 2. There was David, 70-year-old straight man whose son had committed suicide years ago because the church wouldn't accept him. There was Alina, a trans teenager who had found us online. They weren't fighting back. They weren't screaming. They were singing. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Their voices were shaky, but they were louder than the chants. Michael let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a month. He unlocked the car door. Okay, he said. Let's go to church. He walked through the gauntlet. Michael didn't look down. He looked at every single protester in the eye, nodding politely, offering them the very grace they were refusing him. When we got inside, he collapsed into a chair in the makeshift vestry. He was shaking, but when he walked out to the podium 20 minutes later, his voice was steady. He preached on fear that day. He said that fear wears the mask of anger because anger feels powerful, while fear feels weak. He asked us to pray for the people outside, not that they would change, but that they would find peace. It was the hardest prayer I ever prayed, but I did it. For him, Part 10, the breaking point 6 months in, the money ran out. Starting a church is like starting a business, but with a product you give away for free. The rent for the center was increasing. We needed insurance. We needed to pay for the website. And Michael. Michael needed to eat. He refused to take a salary. We can't afford it, he insisted. Put it back into the ministry. I was supporting both of us on my salary as a graphic designer. It was tight. We were eating a lot of pasta and skipping a lot of bills. The stress was becoming a third person in our relationship. One Tuesday evening, I came home to find Michael on the phone. He sounded professional, distant. Yes, I understand. No, I have experience in administration. Yes. Thank you for your time. He hung up and looked at me. Guilt was written all over his face. Who was that? A temp agency, he admitted. Michael, I can't let you carry us forever, Chris. It's not fair. I'm a 30-year-old man with a master's in divinity, and I'm letting my boyfriend pay for my toothpaste. We are partners. This is what partners do. I'm tired. He exploded. It was the first time he'd raised his voice at me. I'm tired of counting pennies. I'm tired of the uncertainty. I'm tired of feeling like I led these people into the desert, and I have no idea where the promised land is. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe this was all a mistake. Silence hung heavy in the kitchen. The pasta water boiled over on the stove, sizzling on the burner, but neither of us moved. Do you regret us? I asked, my voice quiet. Michael's face crumbled. The anger drained out of him instantly, replaced by a desperate sorrow. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and wrapped his arms around me, burying his face in my neck. Never, he sobbed. Never that. You are the only thing I don't regret. You are the only thing keeping me sane. But I'm failing you. I'm failing the church. You aren't failing, I told him, running my hands through his hair. You're just human. You preached about it, remember? Being human. Being flawed. Now you have to actually live it. That weekend, we held a town hall meeting with the new congregation. We were honest. We told them the money was gone. We told them we might lose the space. I expected silence. I expected people to leave. Instead, Mrs. Gable, the woman who had protested us months ago, stood up. I blinked. Sure, I was seeing things. But there she was, in the back row. She had come in quietly during the opening hymn. I was wrong, she said, her voice trembling. I stood outside with those signs. And then I went home, and I looked at my own life. I looked at my grandson, who stopped talking to me 2 years ago because I told him his lifestyle was a sin. She opened her purse. I miss my grandson, she said, tears streaming down her face. And I think God is bigger than I gave him credit for. If God is love, then he has to be here. She walked to the front and placed a check on the table. It's not much, she said, but it's a start.